What if I told you that absolutely everything you were taught about the origins of the great European superpowers is actually hopelessly outdated? For years, we have been accustomed to trusting old textbooks that paint a simplified picture of the formation of modern states. However, the real story is much more complex and contains dramatic twists and turns that are often omitted from official chronicles. However, a sudden and harsh collision with the harsh reality of the boundless eastern expanses caused this ideal structure to crack for the first time. The cold, vast distances and unfamiliar tactics of the enemy began to slowly but surely undermine the strength of the once invincible army. The Swedes encountered conditions for which even the best military academies of the time had not prepared them. Every step deeper into these territories was extremely difficult for the invaders and brought new and unexpected problems. The self-confidence of the commanders was met with the iron will of the defenders, who were ready to defend their land at any cost. The great empire, at the height of its power, suddenly found itself on the verge of a crushing and shameful collapse. The Swedish military machine of the early 18th century seemed to be a perfect mechanism, knowing neither defeat nor retreat. Their tactics were based on a rapid onslaught that broke the enemy's lines before the start of protracted maneuvering. This army had inherited the harsh discipline of its northern ancestors, who had undertaken long campaigns hundreds of years before these events. Like the ancient seafarers of the north, Swedish battalions were accustomed to operating far from their main supply bases. King Charles XII's soldiers were absolutely confident in their superiority over any possible enemy. A strict hierarchy and unquestioning obedience to orders made the Swedish infantry an incredibly cohesive force. Each battalion acted as a single organism, capable of reorganizing on the fly under continuous fire. They did not rely on complex logistical chains, counting on capturing supplies directly in enemy territory. This method worked flawlessly in the densely populated areas of Central Europe with its well-developed transport infrastructure. However, on the endless eastern plains, this logistical principle proved to be a fatal mistake in overall planning. The vast distances between settlements deprived the army of the ability to quickly replenish its dwindling food supplies. Charles XII was confident that one decisive battle would force the Russian ruler to immediately sue for peace. He tirelessly sought this decisive battle, maneuvering his regiments across the endless southern steppes. The Russian army, on the contrary, skillfully avoided direct confrontation, preserving its main combat potential. They forced the Swedes to waste precious time crossing dense forests and swampy marshes. With every kilometer they advanced eastward, the striking power of the Scandinavian regular army inexorably melted away. Their brilliant marches turned into an exhausting struggle to overcome endless natural and man-made obstacles. One of the key problems was the lack of materials to repair the soldiers' equipment and gear. Far from their factories, Swedish engineers were unable to fully maintain their entire artillery fleet. Cannons got stuck in the spring mud, slowing down the advance of the entire huge marching column. The command had to abandon some of the heavy weapons in order to maintain the maneuverability of the infantry. Paradoxically, this decision deprived them of their firepower advantage in possible future clashes. The army became more maneuverable, but rapidly lost its original crushing firepower. The clash of two completely different military philosophies became inevitable with each passing day. The Swedish reliance on individual training and aggressive pressure was met with methodical calculation and a competent engineering approach. The Russian command turned the very geography of their country into an insurmountable physical barrier for the invaders. This conflict grew from a routine territorial dispute into a real battle for the survival of entire state systems. The outcome of this grand confrontation would determine the fate of all of Eastern Europe for centuries to come. Tensions mounted, foreshadowing a large-scale clash between huge military formations. The Swedish army's turn to the southern territories seemed a logical step in the search for fresh resources. Charles XII counted on lands rich in food that could feed his huge and hungry army. However, this maneuver only exacerbated their strategic position, maximally lengthening their supply lines. The Russian command foresaw this turn of events and prepared appropriate large-scale countermeasures in advance. The Swedish army was moving deeper and deeper into territory where the enemy had absolute control. In these lands, Russian troops employed tactics of creating insurmountable engineering barriers in the enemy's path. They completely destroyed bridges, set up barricades in dense forests, and blocked major road intersections. The advance of the Swedish columns slowed to a critical point, requiring constant and extensive engineering work. Every kilometer of the way came at the cost of incredible physical effort by military engineers and ordinary infantrymen. The army spent its precious resources not on major battles, but on overcoming artificially created obstacles. This systematic territorial exhaustion was the main basis of the Russian strategic plan in this campaign. Swedish foragers encountered enormous and insurmountable difficulties in their attempts to gather provisions in the surrounding villages. The local population carefully hid all supplies and fled en masse to the forests when enemy troops approached. The huge Scandinavian army found itself isolated in the middle of potentially fertile but artificially devastated lands. The search for any available food became the main daily task for the vast majority of Swedish battalions. Strict military discipline began to be severely tested due to the constant shortage of basic resources for life support. The ideal military mechanism began to show obvious failures under the weight of the impending logistical collapse. Russian flying cavalry units kept a close and constant watch on the enemy's movements. They intercepted all couriers, cutting off the Swedish high command from communication with their bases in Central Europe. This information blockade proved no less devastating than the food blockade in the south. The Swedish headquarters made important decisions in conditions of acute shortage of reliable intelligence on the movements of enemy forces. This led to gross errors in maneuvering and completely unnecessary expenditure of personnel energy. The Russian army, on the contrary, had a crystal-clear picture of what was happening throughout the vast theater of war. The heavy autumn rains turned the dirt roads into an impassable mess of mud and slippery clay. Heavy wagons carrying the remaining supplies got stuck deep in the mud, catastrophically delaying the movement of all combat formations. The Swedish infantry was forced to wade through the swamps, losing their shoes and the remains of their worn-out equipment. In such conditions, it was completely impossible to use the famous tactic of a rapid, linear bayonet charge. Nature seemed to have rebelled against the foreign invaders, actively supporting the defensive efforts of the Russian side. This exhausting autumn march remained forever in the memory of Swedish veterans as the most difficult physical test. Charles XII sincerely hoped that the arrival of reinforcements from Europe would remedy the catastrophic supply situation. A huge reserve corps with full supply trains was moving to join the main army, carrying much-needed supplies. However, the Russian command discovered this movement in time and developed a flawless plan for an operational interception. Blocking this important reserve became one of the most important tasks for maintaining the strategic advantage that had been achieved. The success of this operation was supposed to finally deprive the Swedes of any chance of a victorious conclusion to this long campaign. The fate of the entire campaign was now being decided not only in the wide steppes, but also at forest crossings. The Swedish king made a very big bet on political divisions within the regional local elites. He entered into deeply secret negotiations with Hetman Mazepa, hoping to obtain powerful military and logistical support. This alliance was supposed to provide the Swedish army with fresh regiments and extensive food supplies. The plan looked truly brilliant on paper, promising an instant change in the balance of power in the southern theater of operations. However, the reality turned out to be completely different, turning this diplomatic gambit into a grand historical failure. The hetman's defection to the Swedish monarch did not cause a mass defection of his supporters. The overwhelming majority of local commanders and ordinary residents remained unconditionally loyal to the central Russian government. Instead of the expected army of thousands, only a small detachment of the hetman's personal guard joined the Swedes. This was a huge disappointment for the entire Swedish headquarters, which had been counting on a full-fledged and combat-ready military coalition. The political intrigue did not bring any real military dividends, only complicating the overall strategic situation. Hopes for easy replenishment of resources and rest collapsed overnight, leaving the army with nothing. The Russian High Command reacted to this event swiftly and decisively. They immediately occupied the hetman's key fortified headquarters, where the main supplies of provisions and artillery were located. The Swedish army, desperately rushing to these warehouses, arrived too late and found only empty fortifications. This preemptive maneuver finally deprived Charles XII of the ability to feed his exhausted infantry regiments. The loss of these strategic supplies was an absolute turning point in the entire logistics of the Swedish campaign. Now they found themselves locked in unfamiliar territory without any reliable sources of sustenance. Left without support, Swedish troops were forced to spread out in search of any scraps of provisions. This severely disrupted their famous tight formation, leaving individual foraging units vulnerable to attack. Russian regular troops methodically pushed the enemy away from the few surviving and undestroyed settlements. Every attempt by the Swedes to organize centralized supplies was thwarted by the rapid maneuvers of the mobile Russian dragoons. The European invasion army found itself under constant pressure with no chance of seizing the initiative. Charles's brilliant political plan turned into a banal and very difficult struggle for daily survival. The local population continued to engage in active passive resistance, flatly refusing to cooperate with the invaders. They reliably hid grain in deep secret pits and destroyed mills before retreating to safe areas. This silent popular struggle contributed greatly to the overall depletion of the enemy's armed forces. Swedish intelligence was completely unable to obtain reliable information about the area from the secretive locals. Old maps became useless, and captured guides often led troops into impassable steppe swamps. The hostility of the surrounding environment broke the morale of the occupiers much more effectively than open combat. By the onset of the harsh winter, the situation of the Swedish army had become absolutely critical by all existing indicators. They found themselves infinitely far from home, without allies, without food, and with dwindling supplies of valuable ammunition. The Great Army, which had once inspired sincere awe throughout Europe, had become a pitiful shadow of its former glory. The Russian command waited patiently for the harsh weather to finish the job of exhausting the enemy. They skillfully avoided unnecessary risks, understanding that time was their most reliable ally. The trap had snapped shut, and all that remained was to wait for the inevitable denouement of this historical drama. The winter of 1708 was one of the harshest in the long history of European observations. The temperature plummeted to incredible sub-zero levels, turning the southern steppes into an endless ice desert. For the Swedish army, deprived of warm quarters and quality winter clothing, this was a death sentence. General Frost struck the enemy's unprotected positions with merciless force, paralyzing any complex maneuvers. Nature seemed to have decided to actively intervene in the course of history, siding with the defending Russian troops. King Charles XII's soldiers were forced to spend the night in the open, freezing air, lighting sparse and weak fires. There was a severe shortage of firewood in the camps, as Russian troops had carefully cleared the area of forests in advance. The lack of storm tents and warm woolen greatcoats led to a massive loss of combat effectiveness among the personnel. Weapons were thickly covered with frost, and the metal parts of muskets became brittle from the extreme nighttime cold. Physical exhaustion was greatly exacerbated by constant sleep deprivation and a critical lack of high-calorie food. The great Swedish army literally froze on the march, losing its best veteran personnel without firing a single shot. The Russian army, on the contrary, was well prepared in advance for full-scale combat operations in such conditions. The soldiers received warm sheepskin coats, comfortable felt boots, and sufficient portions of hot and nutritious food in a timely manner. The command organized regular rotation of units, allowing regiments to rest in warm, spacious earthen shelters. This systematic care for personnel stood in sharp and favorable contrast to the deplorable state of affairs in the enemy camp. The winter campaign clearly demonstrated the enormous superiority of the Russian logistics system over the unprepared Swedish one. The cold, which relentlessly put some out of action, became a reliable natural shield for other regiments. The frozen rivers ceased to be natural water barriers, opening up new, fast routes for movement. Russian engineering units effectively used the solid ice cover to quickly transport artillery and heavy cargo. This allowed them to quickly concentrate their forces in threatened areas, outmaneuvering their slow and tired enemy. Swedish generals could not predict the direction of the attacks, as the familiar geography of the region had changed beyond recognition. The landscape had temporarily turned into a continuous ice plain, ideal for large-scale Russian maneuvers. The Russian High Command made very productive use of the long winter lull for intensive training of reinforcements. Numerous recruits successfully mastered advanced methods of concentrated fire and learned to interact with powerful artillery. Military engineers actively developed new types of field fortifications adapted for rapid construction in frozen ground. Extreme cold forced the Swedes to finally abandon most of their heavy artillery. The massive guns were frozen solid in the frozen ground, and it was physically impossible to move them without special mechanisms. The army was permanently deprived of its main firepower, turning into a poorly armed infantry unit. This difficult decision was a necessary measure dictated by the instinct of self-preservation, rather than a cunning tactical calculation. The loss of his best artillery forever deprived Charles XII of the ability to dictate his terms on the open battlefield. The experienced Russian gunners thus gained absolute and overwhelming superiority in long-range firepower. The winter of 1708 became the merciless filter that sifted out all the illusions of the Swedish command. Nature clearly showed that even the most perfect European military machine was powerless against the unyielding laws of climate. How much do you think such weather conditions were able to alter the army's plans? Poltava was by no means a first-class stone citadel, but its favorable strategic position made it the key to the region. It was here that important communications intersected, and the granaries stored significant reserves of much-needed food and ammunition. Capturing this road junction would allow the exhausted Swedish army to establish a fortified base for rest and regrouping. The city's defenders were well aware of the strategic importance of their mission and prepared diligently for a long and stubborn defense. The command of the besieged garrison immediately set about strengthening the ramparts and creating additional complex engineering barriers. The combined garrison of the fortress consisted of several thousand trained regular soldiers and a motivated local militia. In a very short time, They erected a complex system of deep trenches and sturdy palisades, turning the city into a tough nut to crack for the besiegers. The competent defense was built on the principle of deep echeloning, which made it possible to successfully repel frontal attacks on different fronts for a long time. This architectural approach was reminiscent of classic fortification methods, honed during the large-scale European conflicts of the Middle Ages. Virtually every street and every strong house was carefully prepared for protracted urban positional battles. The Russian High Command constantly and secretly transferred small, fresh reinforcements to the fortress under the cover of night. The defenders of the earthen fortress regularly responded with very active sorties, destroying the fruits of many days of labor by exhausted Swedish sappers. They suddenly and fiercely attacked the enemy's front trenches, burying them with earth and destroying valuable engineering tools. These daring night raids completely prevented the besiegers from consolidating their positions and approaching the city walls. The initiative in this exhausting positional struggle belonged entirely to the garrison, which made very skillful use of its knowledge of the terrain. The Swedish High Command was forced to keep significant forces on constant alert to repel these sorties. The nervous tension among the freezing besiegers grew inexorably with each day of unsuccessful attempts to storm the walls. Meanwhile, the main forces of the fresh Russian army under the command of Peter the Great had moved close to the area of the protracted siege. They set up a powerful fortified camp nearby, looming menacingly over the positions of the besieging Swedish infantry regiments. This created a strategic situation unique in military history. The besieging army itself was unexpectedly under direct threat of encirclement. Charles XII was tightly squeezed between the rebellious steppe fortress and the huge, well-armed army of his opponent. From then on, his every move was strictly and methodically controlled by Russian cavalry patrols and advanced artillery batteries. The strategic trap had snapped shut, leaving the Scandinavian monarch with an extremely narrow corridor for making adequate tactical decisions. In the Swedish siege camp, real panic was rapidly growing due to the realization of the complete hopelessness of the situation. The exhausted soldiers fed on roots they found and the remains of spoiled food, rapidly losing their physical fitness. The officers clearly understood that remaining passive in their positions would lead to the complete collapse of the army without any open battle. The only slim chance of salvation was an incredibly desperate attack on the main forces of the Russian Tsar in their camp. It was an extremely risky decision, dictated by extreme desperation and a complete logistical stalemate. The Grand Army feverishly prepared to stake absolutely all of its remaining meager resources in one throw. The grueling siege of the earthen fortress successfully accomplished its main strategic objective, reliably pinning down the enemy's main forces. It gave Peter the necessary precious time to deploy his main forces in perfect battle order. A general battle was becoming absolutely inevitable, and both exhausted sides began their final preparations for a decisive large-scale clash. Peter the Great decided not to just passively wait for the Swedes to attack his camp, but to actively shape the geometry of the battlefield. He ordered the construction of a unique system of advanced earthen fortifications, redoubts, in the path of the enemy's likely advance. These quadrangular earthen forts were arranged in a strict checkerboard pattern, completely blocking the narrow passage between the dense forest and the swamp. This broken geometry forced the advancing enemy to break up their monolithic formation and expose their flanks to deadly crossfire. It was a truly revolutionary and incredibly bold tactical decision for the beginning of the turbulent 18th century. The large-scale construction of redoubts was carried out in the strictest secrecy, mainly during the dark and foggy hours of the night. Soldiers worked as quietly as possible, moving tons of heavy earth to create high defensive ramparts and deep moats. By early morning, an insurmountable line of complex engineering obstacles had grown before the astonished Swedish forward observers. Each redoubt was a completely autonomous firing point, manned by a separate garrison and equipped with field artillery. The distance between these forts was calculated by engineers to ensure a completely continuous firing range. The Russian High Command ingeniously turned the open field into a veritable death trap for the advancing Swedish infantry. The Russian garrisons, sheltered inside the redoubts, were strictly instructed to fire continuously and with extreme accuracy. They were well protected from Swedish counterfire by high earthworks and could calmly select their targets. The forts were strongly supported by reserve cavalry, positioned behind the line of fortifications and ready for instant counterattacks. Any attempt by the Swedes to stop for an organized assault on the redoubt led to a loss of momentum in their entire global offensive. If they ignored these fortifications and continued forward, the garrisons fired volleys directly at their unprotected backs. It was a perfect and ruthless tactical trap from which there was simply no safe and quick escape. Early in the morning of the decisive day, the Swedish army desperately launched an attack, trying to break through this system of earthen ramparts. The first advancing battalions encountered an incredibly dense barrage of lead and cast iron, instantly losing their initial offensive momentum. With no heavy artillery to quickly destroy the fortifications, they were forced to attack with cold weapons. In the thick smoke and chaos of the ensuing battle, several Swedish infantry regiments broke away from the main forces and became completely lost. They found themselves completely isolated on a huge battlefield and were quickly surrounded by fresh Russian reserve units. The loss of centralized control proved fatal for the once perfectly functioning and invincible Scandinavian military machine. The commanders were completely unable to coordinate the actions of their battalions, helplessly drowning in the roar of Russian artillery fire. The system of earthen redoubts fulfilled its defensive function 100%, destroying the organizational structure of the advancing enemy. The perfect European mechanism broke down against the simple but ingenious geometry of the earthen ramparts. Weakened and incredibly exhausted by the difficult breakthrough through the redoubts, the Swedish battalions finally emerged into open space. Before them stood a huge, completely fresh and well-armed enemy army, fully prepared for a general battle. The psychological effect of this sudden sight was truly devastating for the weary Scandinavian soldiers. They realized with horror that their incredible efforts on the front line were only a prelude to the real battle. They no longer had the physical strength or fresh reserves to continue their massive frontal assault. The point of no return had been passed, and retreating in their previous orderly fashion was now absolutely impossible. They formed a very thin line, as they critically lacked the manpower to create a traditional deep formation. The Russian army, on the other hand, formed an incredibly dense and powerful front consisting of two deep lines of armed infantry. The flanks of both armies were reliably covered by numerous cavalry, fully prepared for swift flanking maneuvers. The vast battlefield was quickly enveloped in thick gunpowder smoke, concealing the true scale of the grandiose clash that was taking place. Artillery from both irreconcilable sides began an intense exchange of volleys, heralding the imminent and decisive approach of the infantry. Russian field artillery had overwhelming numerical and qualitative superiority in this fierce exchange of blows. Hundreds of modern cannons rained down a continuous hail of heavy cast iron on the Swedish ranks, tearing huge gaps in their formation. The Scandinavian artillerymen, with only a few light guns at their disposal, were unable to offer adequate resistance. The Swedish infantry was forced to stand under this crushing and accurate fire, gritting their teeth and closing ranks tightly. Their famous iron discipline was put to the severest test in conditions of absolute enemy fire superiority. Every meter of forced advance toward the Russian positions was achieved with incredible and painful effort of will. On their right flank, the Swedes managed to achieve some local success thanks to an incredible exertion of their last reserves of strength. Their elite guard battalions were able to push back the first line of Russian troops, creating a temporary threat of a breakthrough. At this most critical moment, Peter the Great personally led a powerful counterattack by the second echelon of his infantry. His bold presence on the front line inspired the soldiers, causing them to rally and repel the advancing and desperate enemy. The monarch's leadership played an absolutely decisive role in quickly stabilizing the situation in the most dangerous part of the battlefield. The Swedish offensive faltered when it encountered the unyielding will and overwhelming numerical superiority of the fresh Russian troops. The numerous Russian cavalry on the flanks began to successfully implement a pre-planned plan to encircle the enemy lines. Powerful squadrons of heavy dragoons crushed the light Swedish cavalry, depriving the infantry of cover and routes for an organized retreat. This rapid maneuver threatened to completely encircle Charles XII's entire group in the very center of the field. The Swedish commanders realized with horror the scale of the impending disaster and tried to hastily organize a systematic retreat. However, control of the troops was finally and irrevocably lost in the din of battle and thick gunpowder smoke. The army began to rapidly disintegrate into separate, uncontrollable fragments, frantically searching for ways to escape. The pursuit of the panicked, retreating enemy was organized by the Russian side quickly and extremely harshly. The Russian light cavalry did not give the Swedes any opportunity to stop and form new defensive lines. They drove the remnants of the enemy army to a wide river, driving them into a natural geographical trap that was impossible to overcome. The clash between two completely different military systems ended in an absolute victory for the modernized regular Russian army. The traditional Swedish reliance on individual valor unconditionally gave way to a systematic approach and firepower. The Russian command clearly demonstrated that careful planning and logistics are much more important than blind aggressive pressure. The remnants of the once great and invincible army found themselves tightly pressed against a water barrier with no means of crossing. Their fate was completely sealed, and all that remained for the victors was to document this historic event. The defeat of the Swedish forces on the battlefield smoothly and inevitably led to the grand capitulation of the entire military campaign. The retreat of the remnants of the Swedish forces quickly turned into an uncontrollable and completely chaotic flight. Soldiers who had been sincerely proud of their invincibility early that morning now thought only of their physical survival. The complete absence of unified command greatly exacerbated the panic, turning regular combat regiments into a disorganized mob. Pushed back to a wide and deep river, they had no pre-prepared pontoons or boats for a quick crossing. Russian cavalry patrols constantly and mercilessly harassed the retreating troops, preventing them from setting up a temporary fortified camp. The situation in the camp of the defeated enemy resembled the darkest final act of an ancient tragedy about the fall of a great empire. The remaining officers desperately tried to restore some semblance of order, but their timid orders were drowned out by the general chaos. The iron discipline that had held this army together for decades evaporated in just a few short hours. Many units found themselves hopelessly mixed up, having lost their battle standards and clear regimental affiliation. In such conditions, organizing a reliable circular defense on the riverbank was a virtually impossible task for the officers. Exhausted physically and morally, the soldiers simply fell to the damp ground, awaiting their inevitable fate. The perfect formation of the renowned Northern Infantry finally ceased to exist on these inhospitable shores. numerous Russian corps, pursuing the enemy, approached the Swedish gathering in perfect battle order. They lined up on the surrounding hills, deploying their artillery and pointing their guns directly at the enemy camp. The command of the Russian regular army was in no hurry to start the slaughter, preferring to resolve the matter through bloodless diplomacy. They understood perfectly well that the enemy was reliably cornered and completely incapable of putting up serious resistance. A demonstration of overwhelming power was intended to finally convince the Swedes of the futility of further bloodshed. Peter the Great offered the defeated enemy honorable terms for ending hostilities and saving the lives of soldiers. The Russian high command showed respect for the defeated enemy, observing the unspoken rules of warfare of the time. Swedish officers who were taken prisoner were kindly allowed to keep their personal cold weapons as a sign of recognition of their courage on the battlefield. The surrendered soldiers were immediately registered and distributed for transport to the rear regions of the country. This humane attitude emphasized Russia's new status as a civilized European power that adhered to the laws of honor. Peter the Great brilliantly demonstrated to the whole world that his empire was capable not only of victory, but also of generosity. The triumph of Russian arms was complete, both in a purely military and diplomatic sense. The loss of the entire land army proved fatal to the Swedish kingdom's geopolitical ambitions on the continent. The country lost its best, most experienced, and most loyal soldiers overnight, and it was impossible to make up for this loss. Huge state financial investments in the military machine evaporated along with the surrender of weapons on the banks of this river. Sweden instantly went from being a powerful superpower on the attack to a country on the defensive and getting weaker. This power vacuum in Eastern Europe was immediately filled by the strong and renewed Russian Empire. The balance of power shifted dramatically and irreversibly toward the wide eastern borders of the European continent. For Russian society, this incredible triumph had enormous psychological and unifying national significance. Years of difficult reforms, which demanded enormous sacrifices from the ordinary population, proved their historical justification. Experienced diplomats in the capitals flatly refused to believe the first reports of the complete destruction of the Swedish military machine. The invincible veterans of Charles XII, before whom the coalitions had recently trembled, voluntarily laid down their magnificent weapons. This unprecedented event finally shattered the long-standing myth of the unconditional superiority of Western European military schools over Eastern armies. Russian troops demonstrated incredible progress, surpassing their recent teachers in tactics, field engineering, and artillery. News of the general battle spread like wildfire across the continent, radically changing the tone of all international negotiations. Captured high-ranking Swedish officers were invited to a gala dinner in the Russian emperor's campaign tent. Peter the Great raised a famous toast to his teachers in the art of war, paying sincere respect to the enemy. This noble gesture by the monarch underscored the Russian leadership's absolute confidence in its newly acquired strength. The victors allowed themselves a rare magnanimity that only truly powerful states can demonstrate. Swedish generals were forced to acknowledge the genius of the Russian strategy of attrition and the brilliant execution of the general battle. Their candid testimony became invaluable material for the General Staff's analysis of the mistakes of Scandinavian military planning. The defeat of the main land forces allowed Russia to launch a large-scale counteroffensive on all other fronts. Russian regular troops began to methodically drive Swedish garrisons out of Baltic fortresses and major port cities. Freed from the threat of a major attack, Peter the Great's regiments acted incredibly quickly, confidently, and as effectively as possible. The strategic initiative was finally seized, and now it was Russia that dictated the pace of the entire northern campaign. The dream of securing completely safe access to the sea began to take shape thanks to this fundamental victory. The maps of the region were redrawn in full accordance with the new and harsh political realities of the time. Russia's allies in the anti-Swedish coalition, who had previously suffered humiliating defeats, regained their lost confidence. The states that had left the war under direct pressure from the Scandinavian monarch hastened to break the unfavorable treaties imposed on them. Sweden's diplomatic isolation became as indisputable a fact as its complete military exhaustion in the steppes. The political landscape of Europe was changing as rapidly as the balance of power on the battlefield of Poltava. The Russian Empire took a central and honorable place in the new alliances, acting as a guarantor of security for the entire region. This was a colossal and successful leap forward in the development of international diplomatic relations for the young state. This battle became a textbook example of indirect action strategy and victory over a numerically superior enemy. The Russian High Command used space, harsh climate, and logistics as its main and most powerful weapons. They forced the enemy to lose a long campaign, even before the first volley of the general battle was fired. The art of systematic attrition proved to be a much more effective tool than a straightforward aggressive bayonet charge. This invaluable experience was carefully studied and documented for the training of future generations of general staff officers. Russia had found its own, completely unique and incredibly victorious military school. The results of this grandiose military campaign forever changed Russia's status in the eyes of the entire world community. From a distant peripheral state, it instantly became a key player without which no global issue could be resolved. European monarchs were forced to recognize the Russian ruler's title of emperor, confirming the new political balance of power. Western embassies rushed to the new capital under construction, seeking to establish trade and political ties. Military success on the battlefield translated into economic benefits, opening up access to vital maritime trade routes. Russia confidently and firmly stepped onto the world stage, relying on the bayonets of its modernized regular army. The victory over the invincible Swedish machine became a great symbol of national pride for many centuries to come. This day was forever inscribed in gold letters in the military calendar as a celebration of the triumph of spirit and intellect. The memory of the unparalleled fortitude of ordinary soldiers and the genius of engineers was passed down from generation to generation. The events of this historic battle inspired many outstanding poets, artists, and writers to create works of art. This triumph became an integral part of the nation's cultural code, shaping its identity and self-confidence. The image of an invincible empire was firmly and forever entrenched in the historical memory of the entire people. Studying the details of this campaign became absolutely mandatory in the academies of the general staffs of many countries around the world. Military theorists admired how incredibly skillfully the strategic retreat was used to prepare for a crushing blow. The logistical collapse of the Swedish army became a classic textbook example of how neglecting supplies leads to disaster. Analysis of engineering solutions clearly demonstrated the importance of field fortifications in the new era of firearms development. This battle became a real-life textbook on how to successfully adapt to the changing conditions of full-scale warfare. The experience of the great past began to serve as a lesson for preventing military disasters in the foreseeable future. The formation of a powerful new empire would have been completely impossible without the iron will and determination of its leadership. The ability to learn from one's mistakes and adopt best practices became the most important secret to success. The state demonstrated phenomenal survivability, managing to rebuild its institutions in the midst of a severe existential conflict. This unique ability to adapt and mobilize resources became the hallmark of the new continental superpower. It was this internal strength that allowed the country to withstand the darkest moments and achieve triumph. Victory was a well-deserved reward for the tremendous efforts of millions of ordinary people. The echoes of the artillery salvos of that distant and famous battle still resonate in the pages of world history. They loudly proclaim to the world the birth of a new political reality that from now on had to be reckoned with by absolutely everyone. The story of the confrontation between the two monarchs has become a classic and instructive tale of the clash between pride and cold strategic calculation. This historical lesson remains highly relevant today for understanding the mechanisms of global geopolitics. The birth of the empire was successful, forever changing the balance of power on the political map of a vast continent. This glorious path from heavy defeats to absolute triumph deserves the most careful and detailed study. Russia proved its historical right to be called a superpower by breaking the most perfect military machine of its time. The price of this transformation was incredibly high, but it ensured the state a century of independence and greatness.